my dears, and welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you. Today is another one of those, I read about this old study in my psych textbook and found it interesting, but then turns out it wasn't as advertised at all videos. We've done those for the Stanford Prison Experiment. We've done it for the Milgram Experiment. I have a whole debunking scientific misinformation playlist. I will link above for you if you want to learn more about those. But in this one, we're going to talk about the Rosenhan experiment, which you're less likely to remember by name, but have probably heard about. It's that one from the 70s where a bunch of people checked themselves into psychiatric hospitals pretending to have hallucinations, but then insisted that they were fine and wanted to see how long it would take for them to get discharged and or if they would be found out for being fake patients. Supposedly. Obviously we're here in this video, so it's not quite that simple. Now for some historical context, in the 60s we see a growing anti-psychiatry movement, one that was deeply intertwined with the anti-carceral and civil rights movements at the time that basically questioned how solid and confident a field psychiatry actually was. A psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz published a book titled The Myth of Mental Illness in 1961 that argued psychiatry uses the term mental illness as a sort of scapegoat for lots of different issues people have with their lives, and that the field is no more based in science than astrology is. I read this text in college. I think it operates a little too much on the everybody thinks they're a special snowflake when they really need to be a big kid and handle what's going on in their life side, but underneath that there's a lot of opinions that are fairly in line with a modern mad pride ideology and acknowledgement of psychiatry as a field that perpetuates a lot of discrimination and eugenics and calls that science when it just decides who is crazy based on what is politically helpful. There was also Irving Goffman's 1961 book Asylums that compared institutions to concentration camps and prisons. So these ideas were becoming incredibly mainstream and starting lots of conversations against psychiatry as a field. And psychiatry at the time wasn't in a fantastic place itself. It was primarily centered around Freud's psychoanalysis and the DSM that existed at the time, the very first of its kind, published in 1952. I have a history of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, I will link that above for you, was incredibly unreliable and for the most part ignored by folks in the field, as would the 1968 DSM-2, and it was well documented in literature by many other psychiatrists and psychologists that the currently existing diagnostics were fairly unreliable, with doctors seemingly unable to agree for more than about 50% of the time. So the state of the field was kind of in a bit of upheaval, or on the verge of one, which would then somewhat be caused by the Rosenhan study. Now, David L. Rosenhan was a professor at Swarthmore and then at Stanford University, so different sources will attribute him to different schools, but either way, in his 1961 abnormal psych class, some of the students complained to him about how abstract and conceptual the class was. So he made a comment along the lines of like, okay, then why don't you just go check yourself into a mental institution as an experiment so you can come face to face with it? And then he decided to test it himself. He was there for about 9 days and was deeply traumatized by the experiment and decided that no students should be allowed to do that for ethical reasons, but that became the idea for the famous formal experiment that would follow. The plan was to find people who had exhibited no symptoms of psychiatric illness and admit them to psychiatric hospitals as pseudo-patients, where they would behave completely typically once admitted and see if they're found out. If they aren't, he said, this would support the view that psychiatric diagnosis betrays little about the patient but much about the environment in which an observer finds him, arguing that any diagnostic process that lends itself too readily to massive errors of this sort cannot be a very reliable one. In the final paper published in the journal Science in 1973 under the title On Being Sane in Insane Places, he questions how accurately psychiatry can actually tell the difference between the sane and the insane, and thus if the diagnostic process the field is functionally based on is actually effective. And he specifies that to raise questions regarding normality and abnormality is in no way to question the fact that some behaviors are deviant or odd. Murder is deviant, so too are hallucinations. Nor does raising such questions deny the existence of the personal anguish that is often associated with mental illness. Anxiety and depression exist, psychological suffering exists, but normality and abnormality, sanity and insanity, and the diagnoses that flow from them may be less substantive than many believe them to be. Again, he's echoing a lot of the anti-psychiatric rhetoric that we are seeing in other literature from the time, with some ideas that are really radical and really progressive and great, and some that are just like, whoo, really depends on what you mean by the sentence that you just said, but yeah. According to this study, 8 people, including Rosenhan himself, were admitted to 12 hospitals in 5 different states. Some of them had stays that were like really short, so they went to a different one to try again. And this group was made up of 3 women and 5 men, a psychology graduate student, 3 psychologists, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter, and a housewife. They used pseudonyms and false professions, but the rest of their histories remained the same. They were to call a hospital to make an appointment saying that they were hearing voices, get admitted, and then stop simulating or talking about symptoms at all whatsoever, and they were told they had to wait until they were discharged. They were admitted relatively relatively easily, and 7 of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia, 1 with manic depressive psychosis, which is now bipolar disorder, and their stays ranged from 7 to 52 days with an average of 19 days. And then they were discharged mostly with the diagnoses of schizophrenia and remission, which led to commentary in the article about how diagnoses, once given, do not go away and stick with you forever. He also talks about how that label shades interpretations of subsequent behavior, noting that participants' subsequent cooperation to try to get out and their taking lots of notes was often pathologized by the staff on the ward. Many of the patients figured out that they weren't actually mentally ill, but the doctors and nurses never seemed to. There was also a section of the article about how rarely patients were able to interact with staff, especially with physicians, how bored, neglected, powerless, and depersonalized they felt in their time there, and the extensive amount of medication being used that they all managed to not take without notice on the part of those providing those medications, citing about 2,100 psychoactive drugs being used over the course of all of the participant stays combined. And it asks the question, how many patients might be sane outside the psychiatric hospital but seem insane in it? Not because craziness resides in them, as it were, but because they are responding to a bizarre setting, one that may be unique to institutions which harbor nether people. This is then followed up by a subsequent study Rosenhan did that's published in the same paper, where he told a teaching hospital that sometime during the following 3 months there would be 1 or more pseudo-patients trying to be admitted, and he had the staff there fill out confidence ratings about 193 patients being pseudo-patients or not. 41 patients were alleged with high confidence to be pseudo-patients by at least 1 member of the staff. 23 were considered suspect by at least 1 psychiatrist, 19 were suspected by 1 psychiatrist and 1 other staff member. Actually, no genuine pseudo-patient, at least for my group, presented himself during this period. And this study, understandably, created some chaos in the field. First of all, because it was framed not as a, here are ways we can go about fixing this and improving our field, but just going, here's where everything in this field is inherently messed up. Good luck. And that was both very public and very embarrassing. And the article is written like a colloquial nonfiction story you read in like a magazine or a textbook rather than a more dry academic study. So it's very easily consumable by the average layperson, and he used words like sane and insane that have a lot of connotations for the average layperson. Rosenhan also went on a media tour of sorts, including an interview with the BBC talking about the study and criticizing the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses. For those of you who have been here a while, you know this is an inherent red flag. A media tour about academic research usually indicates some sort of underlying, often political desire for a certain story to be true, which could potentially indicate bias on the part of the researcher that may put their data in question. Not a guarantee, of course, but it is something to keep an eye for. We'll table that for the time being. This is not the first time somebody has infiltrated an institution and written an expose on it. That has been happening for just about as long as institutions have been around, and each one has been a huge deal that has led to some reform, or at least attempts at reform. Big examples of this being Nellie Bly in the 1800s, and the conscientious objectors who were forced to staff institutions during the Second World War, as well as the 1972 Willowbrook documentary. But what this study had that those didn't was expert backing. Those 3 things were all, this is traumatizing and bad, and as a human it like breaks me in half to witness this kind of treatment. But this, I, as a member of this field in control of the entity, am telling you academically it is flawed, is a very different story. And both of these things are super valid and important, but this caused a particular uproar because of its presentation and because of who it was coming from. Many people saw the study as a personal attack on the field of psychiatry and tried to prove him wrong as much as possible, but to some degree, it did do what Rosenhan seemed to have wanted. This is one of the primary things cited as a catalyst for the second wave of mass deinstitutionalization focused on mental and developmental disability that we saw in the 1970s, along with associated mental health reforms. I have a history of institutions that I will link above for you if you want to learn more about that stuff. It's actually not as bleak as you expect it to be. I mean, it's bleak, but it's also interesting history. Anyway, the conversations surrounding this article are also one of the primary things that led to a massive overhaul in psychiatry, pushing psychoanalysis out of the way and striving to create a more scientific field with a more accurate diagnostic system. Within just a few months of the publication of Rosenhan's paper, the American Psychological Association created a task force to overhaul the former DSM and create what would become the DSM-3, which is the one that started to have like checklists of traits. That was added for the DSM-3, and this is partially why. And that task force was helmed by Columbia psychiatrist Robert Spitzer. And even though this paper is more or less what got him the job, the first thing that he did was to try to refute the paper. He pointed out that schizophrenia in remission is a diagnosis very rarely given upon discharge, so it's incredibly unlikely that all of the pseudopatients were given identical diagnoses. He noted that Rosenhan's choice to not name any of the hospitals makes it near impossible to fact check any of this data. He talks about how Rosenhan doesn't really seem to understand the actual medical practicalities of places like that. Much of Rosenhan's data in one section focuses on throwaway comments from nursing staff and assumes that that means these things are being pathologized, when really staff will just note different things in a non-pathological manner just to understand what a patient does with their time. In a way, his assumptions that everything pseudopatients do is being pathologized led to him overanalyzing every behavior the staff do in a very similar manner. He also, according to Spitzer, doesn't seem to understand the purpose and usage of diagnostics, and thus made generalizations and oversimplifications that don't make a whole lot of sense. In his rebuttal paper, Spitzer notes that diagnostics as they currently stand aren't super accurate and have lots of issues and need an overhaul, but it's better than a phenotypic process that differentiates everybody so much that nobody knows what individual people need or how to help and assist them. He argues that for ease of care, there has to be some sort of grouping situation, otherwise everything just kind of falls apart. And he doesn't deny that many of the things Rosenhan brought up in the theory in his paper are issues, just that the overall premise and presentation of the study doesn't quite add up. He also, most importantly, brings up the point that this paper doesn't actually really prove anything beyond lying to doctors works. You can't say that a diagnostic process is broken by actively engaging in deceit in the diagnostic process. He uses an example from scholar S. Keedy on this point. If I were to drink a quart of blood and, concealing what I had done, come to the emergency room of any hospital vomiting blood, the behavior of the staff would be quite predictable. If they labeled and treated me as having a bleeding peptic ulcer, I doubt that I could argue convincingly that medical science does not know how to diagnose that condition. It would make no sense for a doctor to be like, yeah, I think you're lying about your symptoms, so go away, because on the off chance that they are lying for some reason, that might become clear with more observation and probably need help in a different way. And it's also just a poor standard of care, which happens a lot to women and people of color. But I digress. Despite all of the pushback, Rosenhan's paper tends to appear in psychology textbooks completely uncritically without citing or acknowledging any further discussion in the field on the matter, which seems at the very least historically unfair. But that's not the end of the contention about this study. More recently, there was a book titled The Great Pretender by Susanna Cahalan about this study, which she'd taken great interest in and wanted to learn more about. And in doing so, she found the original study notes and hospital records, which had been archived after Rosenhan's death in 2012, and was able to get in contact with two of the pseudopatients. The first was a man named Harry Lando, who was a graduate student at the time of this study, and told her that he overall had a fairly supportive and positive experience from which he learned a lot. Lando's experience was excluded from the final study, reduced to a mere footnote. He published his experience a year or two later to try to get it out there, but it was largely left unnoticed since he wasn't mentioned by name in the article. But interestingly, the numbers Rosenhan used in his study, like the average numbers of days their stays lasted, and the number of medication used, and the amount of time they each saw the nurses and doctors, remained the same in drafts before and after Lando's account had been formally removed from it. Lando also says that some things very clearly from his experience were left in the final edition, which is what led him to write his paper to try to correct the record. So he wasn't actually removed from the study at all, just kind of, where it was convenient for the overall thesis to do so. The second pseudopatient that she tracked down was Bill Underwood, another graduate student at the time, who told her that he basically had no training or information given before going about the experiment. He was told how to cheek medication so he could dispose of it rather than swallowing, but otherwise was told virtually nothing and didn't really write anything down or collect any data during his time there, which raises the question as to how Rosenhan was so precise with all of his numbers and his information. The only other patient she was able to track down was Rosenhan himself. She got in contact with his longtime research assistant. Even she couldn't think of anybody beyond the two of them that were part of this experiment. And in reading medical records from Rosenhan's institution stay, it notes that he gave them way more symptoms than just hallucination, including thinking he could hear other people's thoughts, having physical manifestations of things like grimacing and twitching a lot, and telling the other doctors he was worried that his thoughts were being transmitted on radios and stuff like that, which is very much not what he recorded as having been the standard procedure in this study. She also found that based on his notes, most of the details of his article were about his own documented experience and nobody else's. There were also significant inconsistencies in various pieces of information, including the numerical data that just doesn't add up, and of course, we don't know anything about how he chose the participants and if they were a random sample, or as to how he for sure knew these people had no signs of psychiatric illness. A lot of the methods information just doesn't exist in this paper, nor does it in his notes from the endeavor. But at the very least, we do know for sure that he and two other people did in fact check themselves into institutions as pseudopatients, and at the very least, he seemed to have a negative experience. So, pieces of the study are likely true, but there's so many other pieces that are simply unaccounted for. And the fact that we don't know any of the other pseudopatients and nobody has come forward sort of implies that they probably didn't exist in the first place. But the most interesting about this for me was that the doctor who saw Rosenhan at the hospital he checked himself into was so frustrated at the paper's misrepresentation of events that he reached out to Robert Spitzer and sent him a copy of the medical record from the visit. So Spitzer also knew that Rosenhan didn't follow his own reported method of experimentation. It also seems like Rosenhan knew that Spitzer knew that. But Spitzer still chose to omit this information from his rebuttal papers. Perhaps to slightly cover for that doctor sharing that information, that this was well before HIPAA entered the picture, but also perhaps because he didn't want to entirely discredit the study. There was some merit to pieces of it, which he has acknowledged publicly, and Spitzer had interest in making psychology a more scientific, replicable, and biology-based field. This gave him the position and the ability to make that happen. So perhaps he didn't want to eviscerate the dude completely, just counter-argue chunks to spur wider conversation and try to alter the narrative on some of the more blatant issues. So at the end of this, I think my title maybe turned out to be a little bit clickbaity because technically pieces of the study did happen, but the fact that so much of it didn't happen as reported, or at least there is no record of that, puts the majority of it into question. But what's important about this video series is not just reminding us to think critically about the logistical quality of any research we hear in the modern consciousness, it's also to ask ourselves, why do we find a particular study interesting or engaging? Why is this an attractive story? At the time, this study was the exact publicly accessible thing that anti-psychiatry movement could use as a poster child for their ideas. It also reflected stories of institutions that had been coming out over and over and over again. There was also a first wave of deinstitutionalization in the 60s that became sort of wonky and somewhat stopped after Kennedy's assassination, so this is a great catalyst to get that conversation about mental health reform going again. It was also a great argument, as we saw with Spitzer and the DSM, for pro-psychiatry people who thought it needed to move in a more objective direction. From a modern perspective, it's a great example of a psychological study that led to real-world change, so of course it's going to appear in your textbooks as something important. It also fundamentally changed the field that your textbook is trying to tell you has improved a lot since this time. So saying, hey, this study showed bad things, but now we're better, perfectly fits that narrative as well. I also think the study itself has a lot of really interesting things to talk about around stigma and labels and how the field treats disabled people. There's like this slight tinge to how it presents the information that's not overtly ableist, but definitely not quite the nuance of how we want to have those conversations today. But there is so much around psychology as carceral and judgmental that comes up in this that I think leads to really interesting neurodiversity and bad pride affirming conversations. Like, I would use this piece in a textbook as a way to organically create a lesson plan about the modern versions of the anti-psychiatry movement and the nuance that those things carry that can both acknowledge the harm of the system and the need for the system to provide care at the same time, and the intersections involved in the biopsychosocial model of disability. That would be such a great lesson plan. Please take it from me. Use it. I would love if you did that. Of all the things I've debunked on this channel, this is the study I'm most like, you could have made this point really strongly without fudging data and it would have been more or less great. Like Milgram and the Stanford Prison Experiment both followed narratives that shifted blame for things really weirdly onto people in a way that doesn't feel good and isn't how people work. But this one doesn't do that much. So I'm not sure what was going on there. It's really strange. But anyway, I'm gonna leave this one here. Let me know what other random things you learned about in your psych classes that you have questions about, because I am running out of ideas for this series. Also, feel free to do the liking, subscribing, commenting, all of that. It helps me a lot, as does joining my Patreon, but zero pressure. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.